Hi everyone, welcome to the TBR Webinar series. Today, Principal Analyst Chris Antlitz will be discussing Progress Report, State of the NFV SDN Telecom Market. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping notes. At the bottom of your screens, you can access the slides, audio controls, Q&A, speaker bios, and our survey. After the webinar, you'll receive an email with a replay link as well as a link to view and register for other TBR webinars. If you have any questions for us, please submit them via the Q&A widget in On24. You may also reach out to us after the event at webinars@tbri.com. Thank you again for joining us, and here's Chris to begin the webinar.
Great, thanks Sarah, and welcome everyone. So we're going to be going over some key findings from our most recent market landscape report about the telecom NFV SDN market. So this is me. I'm a principal analyst in the telecom practice at TBR. There's my email address. If you guys want to reach out to me afterward, feel free. So before we jump into the content, I just want to show here the research coverage that the telecom practice at TBR has. So we write 26 distinct reports across the ecosystem, everything from vendor reports like a Cisco, Ericsson, Huawei reports. We also have operator reports. And we also do a series of topical reports in the areas of 5G, the web scales, NFV, SDN, edge compute, and IoT, as well as telecom infrastructure services, which is a big area for us as well. So we do have 3 new reports coming out this year. I just want to highlight that. And I will be doing a webinar. My next webinar will be on our edge compute research. So join us if you can for that. That's going to be held in June. So with that, let's jump into the content. And we're going to give a definition before we talk about anything in the report. I want to make sure everybody's on the same page with what exactly we're talking about here. So our market size data and the way that we think about and write about the market is framed with this taxonomy. So we're looking at the internal and external NFV, SDN-related initiatives of CSPs. CSPs includes telecom operators and cable operators. So internal is looking at the network operations transformation. So migrating from a historical network architecture to a new architecture, which is using VNFs running on x86 servers is essentially what the end state is going to look like for these environments. So everything that is in that stack is what we're looking at. So the NFVI layer, we're looking at the VNFs, we're looking at the full services life cycle that is around these environments. And then we're also looking at the external NFV, SDN-related initiatives of the CSP. So looking at, for example, if a CSP is selling SD-WAN services to customers, we are including that in our market landscape report. So we will talk a little bit about that as well. Okay, so let's jump right into the findings. So for operators, what we're seeing is that leading CSPs are broadening and accelerating their NFV SDN initiatives. And when I say leading CSPs, I'm talking about some of the best known companies in this space in the world. So AT&T, Verizon, NTT Docomo, Telefonica, Vodafone, these are the companies that are really driving the vast majority of spend on NFV and SDN technologies. The benefits are becoming more evident. I think we're all aware of the challenges that these transformations have. These are not easy by any means, and there are all kinds of challenges that telcos encounter as they make these migrations. But what we are seeing is some glimmers of benefits propping up. So we have seen in the last 12 months, AT&T and NTT Docomo make public comments about cost savings that they're realizing from their foray into these migrations. and it's expressing itself most notably in capex. So NTT Docomo actually has said that they have saved, of the domains that they have virtualized, they have noticed a 10% reduction in capex spend in those particular domains that they have virtualized. So those are promising numbers. AT&T has not quantified the benefits, but they have said they are significant. And we are expecting more benefits to emerge, not only cost savings, but also flexibility and agility that this is giving telcos to be more competitive and differentiate their offerings in the market. The second thing here we are seeing is that 5G is a key catalyst that is facilitating and accelerating CSP migrations using NFV and SDN. So why? So 5G is different than prior radio generations. 5G is going to transform entire verticals. It's going to transform society. It's going to transform how people interact with the world. And the network needs to be re-architected from the ground up to support those use cases for the network, to support that reality. You need to virtualize to get the economics, to make it economically feasible to support those outcomes. And you need to virtualize to build a network that is capable of, so it's the cost effectively supporting that outcome and that is able to respond in a dynamic way that's automated, that is flexible, that's dynamic and agile, that can align with the digital business models of this era. 5G is the critical catalyst here because 5G is going to enable, it's a key enabler of these things. So that's exactly what we're seeing. And the other thing is a 5G core, which is part of the standalone spec, which I know most telcos are not going to start with that. They're going to start with the NSA spec, but ultimately CSPs will migrate to SA. With that comes a 5G core, and a 5G core is inherently virtualized. So a 5G core is also equipped to cost efficiently support things like network slicing, which are going to make that end state outcome a reality. So there's a lot of eyes on this, and these things are kind of driving each other. And last but not least here, where's this going? So the way I think about NFV SDN in the telco space, it's driving a fundamental re-architecture of the network. Networks are being overhauled. It's a step function, so it's not happening overnight, but if you look at the trajectory of where this is going and the evolution of the current state of networks and how they're architected and the future state of networks and how they're going to be architected, that is a massive migration, a massive evolutionary step. And we're going to unpack what that actually looks like in the phases of those step functions in upcoming slides. But the end state is CSPs of the future are going to be platform companies running network operating systems. So what does that mean? That means that telcos, the leading telcos in the world, are going to ultimately become virtual network operators, where they are pulling from pooled physical infrastructure resources, and they're providing platforms and orchestrating network resources to provide solutions in near real time in an automated fashion to end users. The leading telco of the future is going to be distant from the physical infrastructure layer. They're going to be pulling from pooled resources from either third-party opcos or tower companies or third-party, maybe government entities that own and operate the physical infrastructure, and the leading telcos are going to operate on top of that. So I'm getting a little futuristic here, but this is what a digital service provider in my mind is ultimately going to become. They're going to become more web scale in nature, more OTT-like in nature, and they're going to run over the top of third-party network assets. I'm talking 5 to 10 years out here. This is not anytime soon, but 5G, edge compute, virtualization, the cloud, all of these things together are going to make this a reality. And it's going to make the leading telcos that are moving down this path, they're going to have, they're going to be able to differentiate and build an economic moat around their business models. NFV SDN is a critical foundational technology to enable this end state. Okay, vendors. So lots of changes in the market. I've talked about this on prior webinars. And, there's a lot of disruption in the incumbent space, especially if you're an incumbent OEM, monumental disruption that you're facing from these changes. So I do want to unpack a few things here. First and foremost, I think we do need to talk a little bit about the implications of bans, especially as they pertain to China-based vendors. So this is becoming an issue. This could stymie industry development. It's creating a lot of confusion in the market, especially in Europe. How do I see this playing out? I see tiers of bans. So we're going to see outright bans in certain countries, such as the States, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan. In other countries, I think we're going to see tiered or hybrid bans. So bans where you're banned from certain domains of the network, but able to sell in other domains of the network. So the one area that's a battleground is the mobile core. And actually, for those of you who have been following the headlines, the mobile core is emerging as the area where they're going to be banned from. And that's mostly a function of the criticalness of the core in a virtualized network. The core, think of the core as the brain of the network. And that is where the security could be at most risk within the entire network. So Vodafone and BT have made public comments about taking out Huawei Mobile Core Kit from their networks and swapping it for another vendor. If you guys haven't read that, I would suggest doing a Google search and you can read about that. But I think that demonstrates that the core is going to be a battleground due to the sensitivity of that domain. But I do not think that Huawei and ZTE are going to be blanketed banned from Europe or other countries. I think that is probably not going to happen. There's reasons for that. One is they enable telcos to be competitive in price-sensitive markets. They also are deeply embedded in many markets in the world, and it's going to be cost prohibitive to swap them out. Basically, the telcos are too deep in to swap for another vendor now. So that's another consideration. And the third consideration, quite frankly, is the burden of proof is on the governments that are making the accusations. And from what we've seen thus far, there is no substantive evidence that suggests that the gear provided by Huawei and ZTE has been compromised. So the burden of proof is on those institutions that are making claims that there is a threat, because no real threat has materialized yet or has been made public. So those are our thoughts regarding that. Okay, so let's put that to the side. Rakuten. So if anybody went to Mobile World Congress this past year, and I'm sure many of you on the phone did, Rakuten to me is one of the most important takeaways from the event this year. And the reason is, there's a few reasons, but first and foremost, Rakuten is going to be they are building a network across Japan that is fundamentally different from anything we've seen before. And it's going to be commercially available across Japan by the end of this year. Now, why do I say it's different? They're going to be using vRAN, a full vRAN stack from day one that is 5G ready. They're going to be running all the VNFs in the network on x86 white box servers. And they're going to be leveraging edge compute to do the processing. So there's 4,000 edge compute nodes across Japan that they're going to be leveraging, and two core clouds that they're going to be leveraging for this network build. It is going to cost a fraction of the cost of what it would have cost to build a traditional network in Japan using the old architecture. So this is radically different. The vendors that they're using some startups like Altiostar for the virtual BBU. They are using some incumbent OEMs too, but if you look at who they're using for hardware, they're using a company called Quanta Cloud Technology, QTC, which is a white box vendor for the hardware layer. So this is very different because in the past, you'd be using network appliances that are proprietary in nature from incumbent OEMs. So this speaks to the disruption that we're seeing in that space. So incumbent vendors, a lot of disruption. They need to change how they do things. They need to be more software-led in nature. The value is migrating to the software layer, and anybody that's left holding the bag, trying to sell black box hardware, their days are numbered. More and more operators are going to migrate to these new architectures over time, and that is going to cap and fizzle the market opportunity for black box vendors. For them to grow, they need to focus on the software stack and selling best-of-breed software in their respective product sets, and also attaching services to that where it's applicable. Okay, so let's look at adoption and how fast this is going to pace. So we've started with humble beginnings in the 2014-2015 timeframe, where we had companies like AT&T and Verizon dabble with NFV SDN. So there was POCs taking place then. Then we saw early adoption. So that's when we saw the emergence of Domain 2.0. And early majority is this year through next year. We're going to see a group of Tier 1 operators driving NFV SDN in the aggregate market. Once we get to the early 2020s, we expect mainstream adoption. Now, when we say adoption, our definition of that is a telco has to be using NFV and or SDN in at least one domain of their network commercially. So it has to be commercially in use in their commercial production network for it to be considered adoption. So we'll see most telcos in the ecosystem by the end of the early 2020s will have adopted NFV and or SDN at in some part of their network. And then anybody in the mid-2020s that starts adopting, they're a laggard. Okay, so let's look at some numbers here. So these numbers come from the landscape, and we also have a deeper study in our market forecast for NFV SDN. So what we're saying here is that by the end of 2022, over $100 billion of capex and external opex that the telcos make will be on NFV and SDN. Let's put that in context. Globally, our research suggests that CSPs spend around $400 billion annually on capex plus external opex. External opex is opex that is addressable to the vendors. So it's things like maintenance services, systems integration services, things that they recognize as opex on their financial statements. So it's a $400 billion market, and of that, we're saying in 2022, over a quarter of that spend will be on NFV SDN technologies. Now, the vast majority of the spend, even though that ramps up quickly, the vast majority of the other spend is legacy. So as we all know, there's a big legacy overhang in the market that telcos need to migrate off of, and as they migrate to the new architecture, and that's going to take years for them to fully see that through. And while they make that transition off of legacy onto the new network architecture, they're going to be allocating an increasing amount of spend to the new. So this is a new slide that we created for this year's report. What this shows is the phases of the evolution. So virtualization means different things to different people. I've come to realize that. So what we did here is we characterized the different phases of virtualization from its humble beginnings in the networking domain to the end state where everybody wants to get to, and looking at the journey and characterizing each step of that journey. So phase one is virtual machines. That's what we characterize it as. So basically taking proprietary network appliances and running a VNF on that box. That's what most builds in the 2013 to 17 timeframe were. When we get to 2018 to the early 2020s, it's going to be containerization, leveraging Kubernetes and Docker as key platforms to build containers within these VNF environments where you can more seamlessly tether resources together and orchestrate them across the network. So it's an evolution of the virtual machines. It's taking VMs and you're putting them in containers so that you can sort them and leverage them in different ways in a more efficient manner. And phase three is end state. So we're going to start seeing telcos reach end state in the mid-2020s. I'd say 2022 we'll see the first telcos start to get there. Rakuten, by the way, is going to be there already in phase two. So they're, the reason I'm harping on them is they're going to be the world's first true DSP. They're going to be running a cloud-native microservices-based network from day one. So a lot of it's going to be container-based, but they have elements that are cloud-native and microservices-based as well. So it's a hybrid of the two phases, and they're going to have that by the end of this year. That's what their roadmap is. There could be delays, but that's what their plan is. And that's where the telcos are trying to get to, right? Rakuten is in an enviable state because they don't have to deal with the legacy. So they're basically building a greenfield next generation network from day one. So they're in an enviable position there. But the telcos are trying to get to cloud native and microservices. That's the end state. That's where you're going to have fully automated networks that are leveraging full NFVO capabilities across the network. That's pulling resources from across the network. And that's where you're able to get to a CSP that becomes a virtual network operator, right? So this is where you can finally get to that end state utopia, as we call it, where a telco can become a DSP, a true DSP that is more web scale-like in its nature. And across each of the phases, we have some key domains that are being virtualized. So in the first phase, it was SD-WAN, firewalls, IMS, CDNs. Those are the areas that were virtualized first. When we get to phase two, it's things like MANO, routers, CCAP, set-top boxes for residential environments. That's really where you start to see innovation there in commercial production environments. And the third phase, it's going to be vRAN and virtual fixed access is what's going to take off. Those are among the hardest domains to virtualize, but there has been significant breakthroughs in the industry in just the last 12 months to facilitate that. Rakuten, I think, is a good poster child for what's to come in the vRAN space. And if they're able to pull this off, there are some people that think they won't, but if they do, it's going to legitimize the architecture, and we're going to see an acceleration of CSP roadmaps to get to that end state because the technology will be validated. Okay, so open source. I do want to spend a little bit of time on open source here. So open source is driving significant mind share in the ecosystem. It's also driving and facilitating ecosystem development. So what we have here, by the way, this is not a comprehensive list. What we did here is listed some of the more important open source initiatives in the ecosystem. I do want to harp a little bit on vRAN because vRAN, I think, has been very dynamic in the last year. We've seen Open vRAN come to the fore, which is a Cisco-led initiative. We've seen the ORAN Alliance, which is the combination of a couple of vRAN-type entities. And then we've seen the TIP program, which is spearheaded by Facebook, also trying to drive vRAN in the ecosystem. Now, why is everybody trying to do this? Well, vRAN has the potential of dramatically changing the economics of providing last mile connectivity. So I've seen studies that suggest that vRAN could be up to half as expensive to build out an access layer network compared to the traditional way of building a distributed RAN architecture. 50% is quite significant when you consider that the access layer is the most expensive component of building out an end-to-end network. So all of a sudden it becomes very attractive to get this right and just do this at scale. So there's a lot of visibility in the ecosystem to do this. And there's also a lot of disruption that is facing the incumbent OEMs that supply RAN, because this could be hugely disruptive to their business models. One general comment about the open source ecosystem is that there's too many initiatives. I think there's going to be a shakeout, and I would expect that to happen in the next couple of years, where we're going to see consolidation of initiatives and we're going to see rallying around certain initiatives that are getting outsized mind share in the industry. Okay, it is worth talking about white box, because white box is a key function of the NFV stack, and it's a key area that is going to provide cost savings to the CSPs. So what is a white box? A white box is basically a stripped down piece of hardware that is running industry standard components. So think about it, if you build a custom PC and you use off-the-shelf components, you can usually build a powerful computer using off-the-shelf components at a fraction of the cost of what it would cost to get an off-the-shelf spec gear from an OEM. So think about applying that mindset to servers and storage and data center equipment, right? That's the mentality, right? That's the idea. So what we are seeing is some telcos are getting bold and they're building custom specs and they're taking it straight to the ODMs in Asia, disintermediating the OEMs that have traditionally supplied them with data center equipment, and they are sourcing white box kit from the ODMs at scale. AT&T is doing this. Let's use them as an example. They are procuring 60,000 routers for their network, for their next generation network architecture. And they're procuring those from some ODM suppliers, and they're paying basically around half of what they would have been paying if they had bought boxes from an OEM. So this is the model, right? Now, AT&T is able to do it. There are limitations to white box, right? They don't come with the support wrappers that OEM boxes come with. They don't come with the same level of software sophistication. So there are challenges there, but AT&T is making it a strategic imperative to optimize their organization to learn how to deal with white boxes in their network environment. And they've also built a custom operating system that they're going to be using. It's called Danos. It's the derivative of their Viata assets that they procured from, I think it was Brocade a couple of years ago. And they're going to be leveraging that in their network across different domains of the network. This is the new model. Now, there are a list of white box vendors. This list here on the right-hand side of the slide is not comprehensive, but these are some of the usual suspects. These are the companies that the telcos are procuring from. So the leading telcos are soliciting, are making orders, very large orders from these types of companies, and they're disintermediating the incumbent OEMs that have traditionally supplied them. That's the key point here. This is why it's disruptive. So it costs less, and they're able to get more flexibility in how they architect the network, and they don't have vendor lock-in, right? You can use any composable hardware from any of these ODM suppliers, layer on your proprietary software or an open source-based software platform on that hardware layer, and you can run your VNFs in a virtualized state in those environments. Okay, so key takeaways, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. And by the way, if anybody has questions, just aggregate them in in the Q&A, and we'll go down one by one. So vendors need to evolve into software-centric companies to stay relevant and profitable in the digital era. So anybody that's their core business is around hardware, that is not going to last. That business is going to be on secular decline. And what those companies need to do is they need to transform into software-centric companies. And I want to give some credit to Cisco here, because Cisco's been doing this. Other vendors have as well, but Cisco, I would say, is the poster child. They've made the most progress changing their company to become more software-centric in nature. They're doing it via acquisition and internal investments. And so what we have here is CSPs are ramping up NFV SDN investment. We're going to see mainstream adoption in the early 2020s. 5G is a key catalyst that's driving this. The end state is CSPs ultimately want cloud-native microservices-based networks. Rakuten is providing a glimpse of what that will look like, that end state is going to look like. White boxes pose an existential threat to incumbent OEMs. So it's about, this comes back to the transformation. An incumbent OEM needs to transform, need to stay relevant in different ways. They need to focus on the software layer and services. And then it also requires a change in commercial and go-to-market models to become more software-centric in nature. So we've got transformation not only in the CSPs, so the telcos are transforming, and by way of that transformation, it's also pushing the incumbent vendors to transform as well. So the entire industry is transforming, and NFV SDN is a key conduit, a key catalyst that is driving this need for industry transformation. With that, we'll open it up for Q&A. Okay, so I'm going to go right down the list here. So is OpenStack losing relevance as shift is strong towards containers and Kubernetes? So OpenStack is still relevant, but yes, there is more I would say there is more of a shift towards containers and Kubernetes. We are seeing that, but I don't want to discount OpenStack's relevance here. They are still very relevant, especially in certain aspects of this space. The next question is, are there reports for NFV and SDN separated? These are very different things. So we are not currently making separate reports. The technologies are similar enough where we decided to do them in a joint report. So both aspects are covered in the same reports. How to get the charts. So the deck will be made available. I think, Sarah, they have to...
If you would like a copy of the slides, please send your request to webinars@tbri.com.
Yeah, if you guys want the slides, we're not making them broadly available. If you want it, you have to email us and specifically ask for it, and then we'll give it to you. Okay, so the next question is, how does Gen Z affect the CSP trajectory towards white box? So yeah, demographics are changing, the end user demographics, and Gen Z and the newer demographics, they want to consume OTT-like services, right? They're accustomed to that. They're used to a digital era business models, and they're very comfortable with them. So CSPs are still locked, I would say, in many cases in the old world, old way of doing things, and the old way of packaging services and selling services. That might be fine for older demographics, but if they want to stay, if they want to stay relevant with how their end customers are changing their consumption habits, they need to start migrating towards changing the network so that it's able to support those new needs from their customer base. So yeah, absolutely. White box is a foundational thing there, because for the NFVI stack, you need something that is flexible and that is able to support what the customers are demanding, that flexible, agile, dynamic type services that they're used to consuming. Okay. So the next question is, can you let me know the email for getting the slides again? So just email me and we'll get the slides. My email is on this slide that's showing right now. So if you guys want the slides, you got to email me. All right. So yeah, it's chrisantlitz@tbri.com. The next question is market share of vendors. So we don't currently do market share for vendors, but that is something that we'll be looking at doing in our upcoming, some of our forecasting, but those reports haven't published yet. The next question is, what are the top telco use cases that will be migrated to VNFs? So if we go back to one of the prior slides here, we can look at that. So the key domains I listed out here. So these are the domains that telcos are focusing on. Now, obviously, there's multiple subdomains within these, but at a high level, you know, things like IMS, EPC, so the mobile core, virtual security, so firewalls, unified threat management systems, CPE, routers. These are all areas that telcos are virtualizing first. They're domains, they're infrastructure domains that they're virtualizing. So use cases could be things like VoLTE, for example, or voice over Wi-Fi. So you're running those typically in a virtual IMS environment, and you know that would be an example of a use case that the telcos are leveraging these technologies in. The next question is, do you think NFV SDN spending will continue when operators are struggling with big debt and focusing on balance sheet strength? So yeah, I think it's actually going to be a more of a driving factor. Look, the telcos are caught between a rock and a hard place. Their core business is being disrupted, and they need to change. They need to evolve into DSPs if they want to survive in the digital era, right? And not fade from relevancy. So if they're going to do that, they're going to have to double down on transforming their network to be able to support digital business models, right? We see AT&T, Verizon, and some others doing this, right? They get it. Telcos that don't do this, you know, they're going to really struggle. They're really going to struggle. So the next question is, which CSPs are leading the transformation? So it's AT&T, Verizon, NTT Docomo. You've got SoftBank in there. You've got Telefonica in there. Vodafone, Swisscom, Deutsche Telekom to an extent. These are some of the companies that are, you know, really driving quite a bit of investments in these areas. So again, if anybody wants the slides, you got to email me because we're not making them generally available. Okay, so I think that was all the questions.
Okay. All right, everyone, please feel free to reach out to Chris with any follow-up questions. If you have a few moments, we would appreciate if you could fill out the survey on your screen. A replay version of the webcast will be available after the event and will be sent out to you via email. To view a list of our upcoming and past webinars, please visit tbri.com. Be sure to join us Wednesday, April 17th for Channel Partner Ecosystems Will Evolve to Support Digital Adoption. Thank you and have a great day.